Why is EDI in retrofit important? I think one of the things we've identified recently is that the sustainability industry itself, whilst very important that we focus on it, doesn't have a great sustainability mix, sorry, not sustainability, a mixed group of people. It tends to be very white in the UK. And so if we are going to be developing a more sustainable future, we really need to bring on board people that have different experiences, different ethnicities, religious experiences, whether they're from have learning difficulties, other disabilities, all of those things, not just the very clear 9 protected characteristics that we get from the Equalities Act. So we're going to look at that from a focus point of view in terms of what's it like to work in a retrofit environment, what's it like to work with contractors, how do we consider the needs of residents when we're doing retrofit. So all of those angles are included in the next 5, and these 5 programmes that were coming up. And just want to thank the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero for allowing us to do this programme of work. I think it's a really important area. And on that point, I think I'm going to hand over to our speaker today and let her get on with the really interesting presentation that we're going to experience. So thank you very much.
Just tell you a little bit more about myself to explain why I'm here in front of you today. I am the director of the Durham Energy Institute, and the Institute is a cross-faculty, completely cross-university. It's almost like a network of researchers at Durham University who do anything energy related. So we do a lot of multidisciplinary projects in all sorts of areas of energy. I won't go into that in too much detail. And my background is unusual in that I studied electrical engineering and then discovered that people were also interesting as well as machines, and I went into social anthropology, and I spent about 15 years doing research on local and regional planning and then on urban regeneration in the UK and also in Norway and to some extent in France as well. At the moment I'm leading a network on equality, diversity, inclusion in energy research, and I'm also part of an international centre on socially inclusive energy transitions that's funded by the Norwegian Research Council. So have a lot of interests in these areas coming from different directions. So it's great to be able to set the stage a bit and think a bit more broadly about why we're talking about EDI and energy, EDI and retrofitting in particular, and how we might remember to put people into the heart of that process. I think probably everyone who's here today knows that building quality in the UK is extremely variable, both in terms of the quality of buildings and also the security of people, particularly being in a home. So I might focus today on residential retrofitting, but much of what I'll say is also relevant to commercial building retrofits as well. There's no question that many of the homes in the UK need to be renovated to improve their warmth and their affordability. But the question is how, in particular the world of social housing, how can you retrofit that with equality, diversity and inclusion while these processes are going on? So I thought it might be fun to just start with a little imaginative exercise. So I'd like you to just imagine, I know that not everyone's able to conjure up visual images in their minds, so you might want to make a little sketch, maybe draw some stick diagrams or something. But first of all, I want you to imagine a plumber. I'll give you a moment or two to visualise or imagine who might be a plumber. Then maybe you could just think of a joiner carpenter. Imagine a joiner or a carpenter. Then next, could you imagine a housing manager? Maybe you know or are a housing manager, but try and visualise who you think might be a typical person who's a housing manager. And finally, I'd like to ask you to imagine a family living in social housing. So I'm not going to put anyone on the spot here, but I'd just like you to reflect on whether the people that you imagined in those different roles were all the same or whether they were different, and why in particular. So that might help us to think about what needs to change in relation to who has which role in a retrofitting process. So let's take another step back now with that in mind and set the stage. So we know that any chance of achieving net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050 is going to require a massive upgrade of housing in the UK. I'm not going to show you the graphs, I'm sure you all know them, but I could even ask you to anticipate what you think the percentage of carbon emissions from the residential sector is, for example. But let's look at the how it's described in official figures. 20% of carbon emissions come from just the residential sector in the UK, and I don't think that's improved significantly since 2021. And if you look at national statistics, you'll find that although overall carbon emissions have dropped quite considerably in the UK, largely because we've electrified the electricity system, emissions in households have fallen much, much less. So it's definitely one of the most problematic contributors to emissions. So if we think of it just in the numbers, so there are around 25 million households in England, just in England and Wales. About 80% are houses and bungalows, maybe about 30% semi-detached, about 25% terraced, maybe a quarter in flats or mobile structures. So let's just put to one side the issue of ensuring that new homes are built to net zero standards and focus on around 25 million or so homes, let's say around 30 million across the UK. 60% home owned with or without a mortgage. So probably upwards of 10 million households are in rented accommodation, private or social. And we know that there are significant barriers for people to make changes to their homes, and they come from all sorts of different directions. We know that, the public attitudes tracker, for example, showed that people face really significant barriers to switching to low carbon heating systems, and it's heating that takes the majority of energy in a home. So, there are lots of options for changing how you heat a house, but there are really significant barriers to doing that. So the key ones that came up in the housing survey were around the costs of installation, some sort of lack of people not being convinced about which technology is going to be right, because everything seems to be changing very rapidly. It's quite hard to make a decision. Some people think that systems are not possible to install in their homes, which may or may not be the case. And also a lot of people just don't know about the alternatives. So this is a pretty major challenge. So it was also mentioned earlier on in the introduction that we have some challenges around matching the workforce to the challenge. So here we have some statistics from the Office of National Statistics on who does the work of retrofitting. I'm sorry that the labelling might be a little bit small, but here I've just picked out four different sort of broad categories of people who might be working in retrofitting. So that's joiners and carpenters, people working in glazing and window fitting, quantity surveyors and housing managers. And the blue figures in the table are men. And if you can see them, the probably what looks orange figures are women. So vanishingly small figures in terms of the percentage of women, and that's just men and women. So we're not even thinking about, other characteristics. In fact, amongst those, for example, 98.8% of roofers who are men, maybe 7% were disabled. It's not clear what the category of disabled includes in there, but there are more people working in roofing who are disabled than who are female. And around 2/3 of those are self-employed. So we have some really interesting kind of characteristics of the workforce here. Also, it's interesting to think about things like the age range. So, for example, 98.2% of people working in glazing and window fitting are men, 84% in quantity surveying, but largely younger men. And amongst about 185,000 people who are housing and estate managers, most of them are older, and perhaps only 60% men. So we do have some quite significant differences. I think it's fair to say that the workforce currently qualified to engage in retrofitting programs doesn't really reflect the population in the homes that require the upgrades. So what? You know, why does it matter? As long as someone comes and does the retrofit, why do we need to worry about it? And that's where I want to highlight the fact that, you know, we talk about retrofitting now, but actually retrofitting is really not new. And anyone who's old enough to remember the 90s and early 2000s will be very aware of the scale of housing regeneration that took place across this period. And we can look back further to the 50s and 60s with the massive slum clearances, for example, as they were called. But even as recently as the early 2000s, whole council estates were upgraded or demolished or rebuilt or sold off. And there's much that I think we can learn from that experience. And I've just put a list of some of the, you know, relatively recent approaches to housing regeneration, and often attempts that very valiantly wanted to include people in the process of urban regeneration, for example. So schemes from the late 90s and early 2000s, things like the single regeneration budget, the New Deal for communities, they were written specifically with the inclusion of tenants and residents in retrofit and regeneration design. So clearly we have a lot of evidence about what happened then, what worked, what didn't work, what was problematic. And also we have ongoing many projects since that kind of wave of regeneration, and there have been many other organisations trying to improve housing. So I think what's interesting is that if you look at the material on retrofitting, you'll find that the retrofit challenge is framed often as a material challenge. How do we change the buildings? But then we know, and I think probably why you're here today is that, you know, changing the buildings alone is not going to work unless people who use the buildings are part of the change. Then retrofitting is going to never reach its full potential. But I want to really emphasise that doesn't mean just change the people. I think it's been too easy for people to say, oh, we're not getting to net zero. We need to change people's decisions. We need people to change their priorities and make different choices about their own lifestyles. But I think this is a much bigger issue than that. I also want to just remind you that looking at that history of regeneration, anyone who lives in public housing or social housing who's over the age of maybe 30, or who has parents who are over the age of 30, they will probably have lived through retrofitting once before, or regeneration. And in that process, they may have been forced to move house when they didn't want to. They may have lost friends by having been moved away. They may have lost money from having to refurbish a new house, or new to them house. And they may have lost opportunities by being forced to move. They may have experienced also really poor design or workmanship. They may have been left in housing which might be warmer but has damp or other problems. And they may also have encountered unhelpful or impolite workers or housing workers. And particularly those bad experiences really live very long in the memory, and they also live in the folk memory. So people who've had that experience are often extremely wary of anything that sounds like it might be a repeat. Also, even now, social housing tenants are often given very little notice about moving. So just imagine yourself, if you were told you've got 2 days to clear your bedroom because it's going to be replastered. That's kind of not very convenient, if I can put it that way. But imagine hearing that if you're bedridden, for example, if you're caring for somebody, or if you're agoraphobic, or if you have issues around having people in and out of your home. And one of the things we know very clearly from previous experience is that having strangers coming into your house is extremely threatening for some people, and rightly so. There are serious issues around security and safety. And so people will sometimes refuse even free improvements because they don't want strangers in the house. So, you know, these things really make all the difference to whether or not retrofit can actually function at all. So I don't want to just talk about the sustainability of the materials or the choices around demolishing and rebuilding. We know a lot about the embodied carbon in existing buildings, but I'd rather just reflect on the experience of people living through regeneration. We know that there was extremely varied experiences through these most recent regeneration experiments. Whether we define them as success or failure, which I think can be a bit binary, we definitely can learn a lot. And one of the things that we learned was that really having residents and tenants properly included in the processes of regeneration is difficult. Okay, we shouldn't pretend it's all nicey-nicey and we just ask people to get involved and then as simple as that. Because budgets are limited. Often the process is understaffed. It's really challenging to reach all the people you want to reach. Some people don't want to be reached, and some people don't want to cooperate. Communities are complex. They're varied. They have different needs. They have different expectations. And if you're going to include people in a process, it really takes quite a lot of time and energy. And that, I think, is one of the kind of, if there's a big lesson to all of that experience, it is that these things take a lot of time and investment, and there's no guarantee you're going to have a brilliant outcome. That does not mean that you shouldn't try. You can be pretty much guaranteed that the outcome's not going to be great if you don't try, but you really need to put quite a significant investment into this process. And that includes lessons like, I think particularly in terms of new deals for the communities, a lot of work had been done in the lead up to that process to build capacity, particularly in sort of known council estates, to train people, to think about how to manage community. And then when the programme came in, it came in with a scheme to elect representatives, and they often weren't the same people. So all that capacity building was basically thrown away. So even those kind of things, we have to think really carefully about the process of including people. But what we do know about what works are some of these principles. And in fact, that image from Bristol County Council also is based on an asset-based community development approach, which says that the assets in your housing or residential area are not just the buildings, it's also the people and their skills. And there will be significant people and skills to be included, but it takes a lot of changing attitudes, I guess, changing approaches to really make the most of that. And that relies on these sorts of qualities, I think. Sometimes when we design processes, we put lots of structures in place, but we are not always great at putting the emotional structures in place to enable the kind of outcomes that we want to achieve. So things like patience, participation takes time. You need repeated encounters to build relationships that are likely to endure, to build trust. But time is your ally, because if you're planning a retrofit program, it takes quite a long time, right? So you use that time to build these relationships, but you can also be using that time to build your workforce, to be training people to develop a diverse workforce. For example, to enable women to become tradespeople, not just by training them and giving them skills, but by enabling them. That means changing the rest of the workforce so that women and now we have a lot of girls going into trades, training for trades, a lot more than before, but still very few of them continue. And that's because the workplace is not conducive to them continuing. So it's like making those changes as well and looking ahead and trying to supply, when we talk about supply chains, we tend to be thinking about materials, but supply chains for changing a workforce are also incredibly sensitive to these kind of details. So, we do know where some of those pinch points are. How do we enable girls to train, become women who are professional tradespeople? How do we nurture them? How do we keep them safe? How do we give them opportunities? So I said here that the issue here is about changing minds as well as changing buildings, and that's not changing the minds just of the residents and the people using the buildings, but the people developing and doing the work around them. And that means having a set of principles around listening, enabling, skilling, sharing. And it takes a lot of confidence for someone running a retrofit program to share the responsibility for achieving the outcomes. But I do think that's key. And where we've seen in the past schemes where local traders are used, where skills are embedded in communities, where responsibility for certain areas of work are shared and people are included in that process, then it can lead to a virtuous circle. We also need to use patience to think about the steps that it takes, that step-by-step approaches are really helpful. And when people have been thrown into a situation where they're forced to use a new technology, for example, it can be incredibly alienating and disempowering. And yet, if you're trained to use a new system, that's the opposite. That's very empowering. So we also have research that shows that if you, for example, you install a new kind of boiler in someone's house, it's all well and good. But if you don't take the time, you know, it feels incredibly obvious to say this, but it actually has to be said. If you don't take the time to explain to people how that new system works, if you don't have support people that they can call when they realise they didn't quite understand, then they won't use it correctly and it won't work for them, and then they'll be unhappy about it. So we've seen that we saw it with the introduction of combi boilers, and we see it with the introduction of heat pumps. If people don't really, they're just given a new system and told to use it, it's unlikely to work. So actually the time to explain to people what the new system is and what the differences might be is really helpful. So the head of the National Energy Action, for example, has been arguing that most people run their gas boilers incredibly inefficiently, and if you turn the flow temperature down, you'll get a much more efficient system. And in doing that, you will also people also will become more familiar with a lower temperature heating system over time. So that if you then want to come and say, we're going to retrofit and move to a heat network or a heat pump, it's not as big a shock because you're already used to one aspect of that, which is the changing temperature regime. So people need to feel the benefits tangibly for what's being done so that they can see the next step and that it starts to appeal to them. Similarly, when we start to talk about things like neighbourhood retrofit, we've seen some examples where neighbourhood organisations will work over the longer term. They might just start by offering people energy advice. Their longer term goal might be to say, we're going to install a heat network, but you don't jump straight there. You have to kind of gradually offer people benefits to being part of something. You know, many people complain now that people feel very alienated, that, you know, sense of community is disappearing, and it's not surprising really. But if you want to rebuild that, you have to take these small steps and do it gradually, because trust takes time to build. So I think that means really taking seriously people's concerns. I did a study of a regeneration project in Sheffield nearly 20 years ago now. And what was really interesting was that right at the start of the regeneration, there was a public meeting, and there was a group of young women from their estate who turned up to the public meeting. Some of them brought their kids in their prams, and they said, you know, what we want is, we want eco housing, we want recycling on every corner, we want a playground for our kids, we don't want any cars so that they're safe. And, you know, that was exactly what the people designing the regeneration scheme wanted to hear. And yet, as the process continued, their voices were just kind of smothered over, and the imperatives of financial sustainability took over all these really essential issues around community and sustainability and safety and security and feeling of belonging. And what happened was that they ran a series of meetings, and the residents who went to the meetings started to feel like they were just going to meetings, and the meetings weren't leading them anywhere. So if you are going to do consultation, it has to be real consultation, it has to be real inclusion. Otherwise, you are actually breaking down the trust that you're trying to start. So yeah, participation needs to start from the beginning and even before the beginning, because capacity needs to be there to think about what are actually really complex issues around retrofitting. So changing minds as well as buildings, both among the people who live in and use the buildings, but among the people who manage them and want to rebuild them as well.